All right, hello everyone. So that was our special new musical introduction, musical selections by one Martin Duffy. Welcome to this week's edition of A Sip of Knowledge. As mentioned, we're here with Marty Duffy, Liz Rhoades, and Lou Bryson, along with this week's special guest, Fionnán O'Connor, author of A Glass Apart, expert in Irish whiskey, among other things. I'll let the gang give you a more thorough introduction in a moment. But first, I'm Will Hookinga from Zavvy.co. And before we jump in real quick, just want to point out, you can say hello in the chat box to your right. I see a few familiar guests already. Monique Houston says dramatic introduction. Yeah. Awesome. And then also, if you have a question at any point during this week's presentation, hit the Ask a Question button in the middle bottom part of your screen. Submit it there. We'll be keeping an eye on those. And last but not least, feel free to invite anyone else you know to join us. There's a share button in the top right that makes that easy. But with all that said, I will turn things over to Marty, Liz, and Lou now.
Yoo-hoo! Woo! Thank you, Will. Hi, I'm Martin Duffy. I'm a long man. Not a long man. I've been in the long-term whiskey guy. I've been in the industry for 30 years now, counting my bartending.
I should stick to saying that then.
Yeah, I should. I'm a long man. I spent many years as master of whiskey for Diageo, a couple of glorious months as the national brand ambassador for Benedictine, and 8 years as the co-producer of the Chicago Independent Spirit Expo. For the last 6 years, I have been the one and only North American brand representative for Glencairn Crystal. Woohoo! Yes. And asked if that was Marty singing. Yes, that was Marty singing the intro song. I rock everyone.
Rocked it.
Wizard?
Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Liz Rhoades, technical distiller and spirit consultant. Spent just over a decade in the alcoholic beverage sector, working across a variety of products. So beer, rum, vodka, my personal favorite being whiskey. I spent most of my career at Diageo, but now I'm currently founder and principal at Spirit Safe Consulting. So Lou?
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Marty. I thank you too for showing up. I'm Lou Bryson, as it says there. I'm in the tornado cellar, hunkered down during this storm. I am a writer about whiskey. I was the managing editor at Whiskey Advocate for about 20 years, and the author of Whiskey Masterclass.
Oh my God, it's
That's
so good.
weird.
Which obviously an extremely popular book, especially one page for Marty. Which
Page 250, right? Is that what we're...
yeah. Are you on the same page or the facing page?
251. Don't buy this one, not this one, because this one has 251 on it. So
anyway, I write about whiskey. I'm currently a senior drinks writer for the Daily Beast website as well. Currently working on a story about whiskey allocations during the pandemic. Hope that'll be out sometime next week. And we need to meet our guest, Marty.
Yes, sir. Well, let's say you took Indiana Jones and you somehow morphed him into with James Joyce.
And Michael Beach.
Michael Beach.
Yeah.
Michael Beach. Yes. Maybe a younger Michael Beach. An Oscar Wilde, a Bram Stoker. If you there's some vampires in the whiskey book. He's a man who, much like Madonna or Cher, only goes by one name. Fionnán. He's actually Fionnán O'Connor, and he's joining us all the way from Dublin. Woohoo! By the way, he is also author of this beautiful book. If you haven't gotten A Glass Apart, if you want to know everything about the history of Irish whiskey, especially single pot still whiskey,
That's
This
the book.
baby. Plus, though I don't see any acknowledgement in this.
Give me a crayon and a book, Marty. We'll solve that right now.
Buy it used. So, Finn, tell us. I mean, first off, I've always been intrigued about this about you. I've known you for a while. Tell us how your life led you into just researching the hell out of Irish whiskey.
So I work as the North American brand ambassador for Riddell Glassware, and we've been looking to aggressively expand our portfolio. So I read the Wikipedia on Irish whiskey just before we logged on, and it's been kind of an art, but I found this book enormously helpful. A glass apart, this guy knows it all. So I'll be mostly quoting from him, but the main message is competing glassware. But in all sincerity, I began as I was actually doing literature and medieval studies as an undergrad, and then kind of followed that trajectory into manuscript studies in postgrad. And
crowded field, though, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh my God. But there's money to be made. My God. Only, and especially some of the stuff I was reading at the end was all like early visions of hell and stuff that I could really have capitalized on with a bit more oratory prowess. I could have just gotten on YouTube, earned a following.
I think that Dante guy beat you to it there, Phil.
Yeah. Well, little known fact, the Irish beat Dante to it twice. So there's two infamous texts called St. Patrick's Purgatory, where St. Patrick sees a vision of purgatory, and another one called the Visio Tenugdali, and that's about a knight who goes to hell. There's no poetry. It's not particularly well written. It's just vile descriptions of like the horrible things that happen. And it was the Harry Potter of its century, basically. It was translated into like 50 languages. Everybody couldn't get enough of it. And anyway, that was my shtick before whiskey. And that and the Italians, Dante, and I could tell you, like that was my part pieces, like what particular gruesome thing will happen to you in the afterlife based on your moral failings. But in eerie reflection of that, I started drinking quite extensively. And yeah,
it's good.
Anyway,
had some wonderful sleepless nights.
Yeah. As an undergrad, I was out in California. I was into whiskey quite heavily as a kind of a hobbyist. And I started reading a lot about it. And I ended up working for Diageo. I met Steve Beale in a pub in San Francisco. And he said, "Do you want a job?" And like any broke student, I was delighted. And even more delighted that my job would entail just going to things and drinking stuff I couldn't even afford on my own dime, let alone, pretend to speak on behalf of this stuff. But anyway, I got very, very lucky. I learned a lot very, very quickly in these kind of, as all, I think, brand ambassadors do very quickly among each other. I started working for a whiskey and cocktail bar, Bourbon and Branch, also coincidentally owned by an Irishman. I started teaching classes. So I was at UC Berkeley, and they have this bizarre system where students can teach classes for one solitary unit if they get a professor to supervise them, and it's kind of to groom kids for academia. And you have to, make up a syllabus, and they come and inspect on you. And anyway, the head of Celtic languages, or one of the seniors in Celtic languages, was willing to sponsor the history of whiskey, which I was the second most popular decal on campus every semester, only usurped by female sexuality.
You combine those two, and you have a party. That's a party there.
But anyway, we made it clear we didn't condone or necessity. It wasn't necessary to drink to take the class, but we would all go to the pub afterwards, and then anyway. So obviously, when you're standing in front of people, you have to kind of learn your stuff more aggressively. So I started, manically trying to prepare stuff, and then between all of these various forces, I just kind of got deep dunked. I came back to Dublin for postgrad, kept doing stuff in whiskey. I left. When I left, I at that point, single pot still was kind of a piece of bartender's esoterica. You know, just as I was leaving California, you know, John's Lane came out, and that was the first kind of breath of life in the category. And anyway, I, from one thing or another, kept working in it. Eventually pulled out to write A Glass Apart, as you know, I wanted to be independent doing that. And by the time I was done, that took 3 years. And stuff I had been saying for free in bars to like disinterested people for years suddenly became like an authority. So it all happened largely by accident, you know, and then suddenly I had a pulpit, and I've never stood down from it. Upon, you know, following several requests to do so, I have never once abandoned the pulpit. And through a bizarre twist of fate, I ended up getting a grant from the Irish Research Council to investigate Irish whiskey mash bills, or lost mash bills, as a PhD. So that's what I do now.
Woof. And you're on this kind of I don't know, is it a government scholarship?
Oh yeah, at the expense of the honest, hardworking taxpayer, I get a check in the mail to read about lost liquor.
Lou,
yeah.
Luke Ireland, Lou. That's what you gotta do.
Yeah.
Amazing. Hey, you know, for those who aren't familiar with obviously a lot of Americans are familiar with Irish whiskey, and other people, I guess we're global right now. We're around the globe on this thing. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with Jameson, Bushmills, Tullamore. Those are three biggest selling. But can you real briefly just go over the various styles, the various categories of Irish whiskey for everyone?
Yeah, I mean, in many senses, they overlap quite heavily with Scotch, you know, and a lot of the terminology is shared, you know, single grain, single malt, etc. You know, in some cases, the terms are grounded in the same history, and sometimes, you know, like single malt as a term came from Scotland in the 60s and has been kind of, you know, used in Ireland to describe things that were already made, obviously. But, you know, there has been significant overlap. The most unique feature, and of course there are, you know, technical differences of what we're allowed to do versus what they're allowed to do. But without getting into the nitty gritty of, you know, who's allowed to use enzymes, the big one would be Irish pot still whiskey, which would be odd because single malts in Scotland are all de facto distilled in pot stills. And of course, you know, you can make bourbon, you can make anything in a pot still. But it traces back to basically Victorian times when there was an understanding that Irish pot still, in discrete contrast to malt whiskey, really referred to a distinct mash run through a pot still. So it was both different in its Irishness and also different to the column still within Ireland. So that's now been labeled as single pot still, largely in echo to terms like single malt and single grain. And the terminology, we can have a lot of fun with how that legislation has happened, but we'll save that little talking point. But at least in premise, Irish distilling around the 1700s, really the early 1700s is where it starts, and then catalyzed by the malt tax in 1785, or the extension of malt tax to Ireland. The use of malt in tandem with raw unmalted gritted adjuncts, the most noticeable one being raw barley historically, but once upon a time also oats and rye and wheat and other stuff. Oats being the kind of the one that everyone gets very excited about, because that was another very dominant participant, much more than wheat and rye, really, if we're talking long history. But raw barley, by the time it reached the late 20th century, it meant a mixture of malt and raw barley together, distilled in a pot still, usually hovering between 50-50 or 40-60. And so that's what a glass.
Was it really the malt tax that drove that?
No. So that's where, so, you know, if you look at like records from, say, almost more than half a century before the malt tax was even passed, you see references to the use of raw barley And of course, diversity. History is muddy and odd and strange. What the malt tax did do, and a lot of that stuff was cross-pollinated over from Irish brewing history. They shared. In fact, there was a whole third industry of brewers supplying wash to distillers. And so a lot of, it's where we get that kind of history. It all becomes less easy to brand and sell versus the narrative, which is that the malt tax happened and then the Irish distillers started, beguiling befuddling the taxman Bugs Bunny style by using raw barley, and that just didn't happen. But it makes for what it did do was it compelled a lot of people to up the raw barley percentage for a period of about 50 years. And when they were on the far side of that, the malt tax was actually repealed, and they kept using raw barley anyway. And you could almost say like what the malt tax did to was put the thumb really hard down on malt. And for various industrial reasons, Ireland took a course against what was happening in Scotland. They originally shared a lot of, there was mixed mash happening in Scotland as well. But because of the stuff that will be forthcoming as a PhD thesis that anyone who has a passionate love for footnotes can read in depth, by the time you hit the High Victorian period, they had reached kind of almost near dichotomy, where they're certainly discussed as separate issues. Again, there is this idea by that point that mixed mash and this particular raw barley and malt tango is distinctly Irish, and it became a very, again, by the time Alfred Barnard did his infamous tour of Scotland and Ireland, he visited 28 distilleries in Ireland, 2 of which were making what we would call single malt, and the rest were either column distillers or mostly in and around Belfast and the kind of industrialized northeast, or Irish pot still, in the mixed mash sense.
So then what was, go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to comment, I bet to make it's quite a bit cheaper as well with a mix of unmalted and malted versus just going 100% malt. So I bet, probably the cost savings could have been another.
I'm sure a big incentive.
So not to derail it, but it's also compounded by agriculture.
That's all we do.
Oats grow very, very easily in Ireland, and in very, very poor terrain. So oats have always been cheaper. Malt was being brought in certain points in history. You had malt come in from England. There was malt made in Ireland as well. You had weird blips of, say, like there was a wheat boom in Ireland during the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon put a blockade on wheat getting to Britain, and Ireland became kind of a breadbasket of wheat, and then that stopped and it fell through. So malt hasn't always been the most expensive thing on the table. In principle, malt is more expensive than raw barley.
Their processing step. That's
absolutely.
So by theory,
the other side of it is ale was generally quite cheap to buy. So if you had brewers who supplied stuff, and of course that's made from malt, and that is often, for purposes largely to do with tax evasion of another kind, cheaper than processing anything altogether.
Sure. So, bypassing upstream processing altogether. And just, I guess, a follow-up question with that, is that commonplace still today? Does that happen at all?
Brewers making wash?
Yeah.
No, it's actually basically illegal. So the technical file has put the kibosh on any sort of relationship there. They say you have to brew on site, or within a proximity to the establishment. Which is
what's the reason given for that?
What's the reason?
I'm not the guy to ask. I have a lot of questions.
Industry lobbying.
He had all the answers.
The other thing to that. Oh, sorry. I'm just tying this back to, since this is a global conversation, I guess, just tying this back to EU regs as well versus what's happening here in North America. Because I asked the question because, this certainly has happened where there's a brewer distiller relationship through, the craft distilling movement. But the interesting, thing for those of you who may not know who's watching, in the EU, to be called whiskey, they can't have any hops upstream at all. Versus here in the States, that's not the case. So I don't know if that could have been a driver with that as well.
I mean, so if you look at the deep history, now we're going very far back for this, but back in the Middle Ages, Irish beer, Curram type drinks were very, very different. And we know a lot about them because the English colonists in the Elizabethan period don't shut up about how much they hate the stuff. They're used to a hopped, what became hopped ale. Originally ale means unhopped beer, and then beer is this hoppish import into England. But they're referring, what they're calling ale by that time is hopped beer as we know it. And they come over, and the Irish are drinking this porridgey goo. If we look at their description of it, it seems to have been a mixture of essentially half malted barley, half malted oats, with no hops whatsoever. And if we look back to early distilling records, we see, centuries before industrialized distilling, we see there's an infamous drink called Bulkum, Bhuileaceann, which means madness of the head, or idiomatically blow to the head, I think in contemporary Irish. And they describe this strange oaten black oat drink so again, like some of that at the very earliest stages is deeply tied to brewing. And it's only later and probably through legislation that they go their separate ways. And eventually the brewing industry in Ireland is quite hostile to, historically, from like Arthur Guinness down, there has been no love lost between Irish brewing and Irish distilling.
Which is funny because Guinness was right across the road from George Rowe, which was one of the largest distilleries in the world. Yeah, and
Diageo now own the place, so the battle came out on Guinness's side. But I mean, that had a lot to do with it. Was just industrial competition. Arthur Guinness spent an awful lot of time trying to make laws softer for beer, positing that, like, well, if we can't get the poor off of drink, I can lure them onto the softer stuff. And there's an infamous debate that happens in what was then the Irish Parliament, or the local Parliament, where Grattan, who was the head of the Parliament, his deputy says, if the poor of this country insist on getting drunk, it is of little interest to this house what they get drunk with. But brewing put out an awful lot of effort to present itself as like the sensible choice before going, to temperance. And again, any number of aspects to that, including the malt tax, which affected brewing as well.
Well, that was the end of the sentence. You Irish talk funny.
Refresh.
End of the phrase.
And then I went up the hill. Got a pail of water.
And of course, a lot of the early brewing and distilling. So you have, Irish brewing is very, and of course, before the potato, which of course came over from the New World, oats were the staple crop of the poor, or the staple food of the poor rather, and continued to be a huge staple food for a very, very, very long time afterwards. So again, they're in abundance, as they were in Scotland, infamous first, major dictionary, Samuel Johnson's dictionary, defines oats as a grain used in England to feed horses and in Scotland to feed people. But you had this idea of oats as the grain you grew if you couldn't grow wheat. And so it does make very practical sense that it ends up, it's not all just people looking for certain flavors, but for various
commodity.
reasons. Yeah. And of course, there are, rye has been grown in Ireland since the Middle Ages, but never in a huge way. It was grown. They still grow it out in the Aran Islands as thatch, basically. I don't know how much they still, but it was grown as a winter crop as well, essentially, as part of crop rotation. And it was grown in something called meslin, where they would sow wheat and rye together in a field, and the rye is kind of an insurance policy. If the wheat fails, there's something. And so half this stuff was mixed prematurely anyway. It's not really.
So a consistency of the whiskey wasn't as important as just consistency of the output.
Yeah, I mean, it's only when you get
something to put out.
consistency comes with scale. When you get big enough that you need to repeat things, and I think we look backwards from a post-industrial era and we romanticize artisan production from the safety and comfort of, like in the US, the FDA, and can wax lyrical about, the things that might have been. But of course, the narrative going into the 20th century was consistency is modern. You want to be sure that you're getting the same thing every time, and so again, they're different stories, but you only start really getting like mash bills in Irish whiskey in any sort of defensible sense in the 1800s.
Have you ever seen, was it Dave Wondrich worked with the folks at Ransom Distillery out west, and they created Emerald whiskey? Have you too, Lou and Liz, have you seen this? Have you seen this?
Yes, the Ransom, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a mash bill that I think David Wondrich found from the 1870s, something like that. Yeah, which was, I believe, at Oats. It was malted, unmalted barley, oats, and I think rye.
Yeah, and so what he was using was something from what's called the Loftus Report, and they did, and I got in touch with them, and they did manipulate it to their own. I think it was a mash inspired by rather than a replication of But again, that one itself is actually quite atypical, and you can find it. There's probably the biggest book on Irish whiskey from like a tax history perspective was written in the 70s by a guy named E.B. Maguire, who worked for the Revenue, and he has that in there, and it's written as an Irish pot still mash bill. But actually, if you go back to the Loftus Report itself, it's very clearly a column still. So even the reference itself is quite anomalous. But what is true is that Irish distilling from that era used an awful lot of oats, rye in certain proportions. A lot of the rye was actually coming in from the US, even though there were small rye grown in Ireland. You had maize coming in for the first time. But again, a lot of the maize and a lot of the rye in those mashes were run through columns, and columns that were capable of processing. It was the first time in Irish history that you had mass grain imports of that kind of scale. And then you had an industry largely in and around Ulster, of columns that was capable of plowing through this stuff. So sometimes people raise their eyebrows in Ireland at the moment that a lot of, say, Middleton's grain whiskey, pretty much all of it is made with, imported French maize and what have you. But actually, that goes back into the history of industry itself, and actually has quite a deep pedigree. The odd thing there, and that's another example of like legislation changing stuff. So there's probably the most infamous agroeconomic law in the history of Ireland, something called the Corn Laws, and corn meaning grain of any kind, in that the original sense of corn. And the Corn Laws were essentially a system of artificial tariffs to keep out foreign grain from the UK, to artificially inflate the price of wheat, largely to keep people in the House of Lords happy after the Napoleonic War and the fall in the price of wheat. And it was a very contentious thing in England itself. Actually, the Economist magazine, bit of trivia, was founded by British economists who disagreed with the Corn Laws. But it really blew up during the Irish famine, because it meant that not only could you not import grain during a crisis, but that grain was artificially expensive, which compelled landlords who were losing money to export it from start to finish of the famine. And so eventually, on the back of this horror, Robert Peel, who was Prime Minister of the UK at that time, goes against his own party and has it successfully repealed. And when that happens, that's 1846, and the majority of the damage had kind of more or less been done. But bizarrely enough, the column distilling industry in Ireland explodes after that point, because you start getting cheap maize in. But rye, in the kind of quantities that you see in the Loftus Report, starts coming in alongside that. So you get some ambiguity where there could be pot stills who are doing a column mash, but it is from the original source, it seems very clearly a column still. And if it's a pot, it's highly atypical. Now, that said, Irish mash bills from the era were rich and diverse and strange and are being horrendously ignored at the present. So I'm so delighted to see anybody anywhere talk sincerely about 19th century Irish mash bills, that it's kind of,
Yeah, it's mostly happening over here, pal.
Yeah.
So
yeah, something you said. So talking about, the rich heritage commodity crops with Ireland, and specifically talking about oats. So I'm sitting here and my heart is sort of like pounding because I'm like, I know how hard oats are to process in the modern day distillery, especially with milling techniques. So, and the food scientist in me, right? And so I guess also, since we're talking about these historic mash bills, I was really kind of exciting to learn more about you and the fact that you're, pursuing a food science degree right now as well. And so I was sort of wondering if you can divulge a little bit more what that project is about and what are sort of the objectives you're looking to achieve with that.
Yeah, no problem. And I mean, food science is a very kind word for what I'm doing. It's, history of food usurping the time and energy of people who, know the science and then taking credit for their, years of research. But my department, so my thesis question is, what were the driving determinants in the history of Irish mash bills from 1785 to 1975, and how can the specifically gastronomic aspects of those mashes drive innovation in contemporary Irish distilling? ?
Sounds like a thesis statement.
Exactly the question I was thinking in my head last night.
Yeah. So and the reason for those dates is it's the malt tax to the final monopoly concentrated in a shared facility in Middleton in 1975, with the exception of Bushmills. And really, it's what I'm doing is food history, but I'm sponsored by culinary arts, but occasionally it's referred to as food science. Occasionally it's referred to, a culinary arts degree, which is even further away from what I'm doing. But anyway, whatever it's supposed to be, it's got a check in the mail coming, and I'll hang on to that with both teeth as long as I can.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, what I'm looking at, so there's kind of three parts to it. One is pure history and talking in bone dry senses about pragmatic needs versus, between agriculture, pragmatism, etc. Why did mashes change? When did mashes become mash bills? How firmly did they become mash bills? Did they overlap, etc.? What happened to change this amorphous creature? And then the second part is a kind of an examination of how that could drive innovation, especially in the craft sector of contemporary Irish distilling. And, there's plenty of ways you can just create mashes that would drive innovation, but how can the specific drawback to the past, create a context, a framework for that? And then the third part, which I don't think I've announced publicly, but I think I can now, is the recreation of historic mashes in a controlled setting, or as controlled as we can get it. So Boan Distillery, thanks be Matty Healy and Michael Walsh, have offered to distill 10 mashes and then controls as well, based on a list I've given them of decimalized historical mashes. And they have been decimalized and chosen for very specific reasons. So again, they're to try and build some sort of question. And I'll be interviewing them while that goes on about things like the pragmatic side of like milling oats, even with today's.
Yes.
Finn invited us to this tasting of these, and I'm assuming since you extended an invite, that includes housing and transportation.
Oh yeah, I mean, so I have the finest.
Per diems.
We're staying here. Is where we're staying.
And a boat. It's a boat. You can buy oars, but it's a boat.
About the size of that toy, Marty. And so you should get the grips with it. And Yes. So what will happen after these are all made is part of it them sending off for mass spec and all that stuff. And then the second is a controlled, or trying to make something that is highly subjective, as objective as possible. So we'll have a panel of 25 industry figures, primarily Irish, but actually would love to have international figures as well. And with blind tasting and nosing both at, normal strength and at blending strength and so forth. And it's all very, simple questions. Please rank from sweetest to driest, preference, etc. Most complex to least complex, and keep it in this. Now I can't reveal what any of the matches are because obviously everybody going in has to be doing it blind, so we don't want any preconceptions. And then part of if you guys want to come again, there's fuck all money, but I could probably rustle up a bit of funding for transport.
All right.
So it sounds like
a shoestring. Michael Fogarty down at Mulligan's is supplying the glassware. This is being done in a fly by night context.
I'm building a dragon boat now that the three of us will take over there. It will be an epic voyage.
You were saying, Liz, I know you've tried to...
I just keep trying to ask questions.
Sorry.
Back to the science.
Nerds.
No, I was gonna say. So it sounds like the sensory approach is more of a hedonic versus trying to get a descriptive analysis portion where you're really trying to tease apart the flavor profile, but it's more about consumer acceptance. It's sounding like.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's only anything we can do, we will do. And I have 2 more years left in the thesis, and so much of my time is spent again in archival stuff, which is really my homeland,
right?
Research-wise, that a lot of this stuff has been drafted, under pressure in other controlled settings, namely phone calls from my advisor. So if you have any suggestions, now's the time. Again, a lot of what I've been doing up to date has been going through archives relating to closed distilleries or to tax laws in Ireland, or trying to just find the mash bills themselves and to create a kind of running.
I'm sorry, Finn. How difficult is that? I ran into you, I think it was last August in Dublin, and you had just come from somewhere where you were showing me these mash bills you had found. And I'm thinking, where do you even go and look for that stuff? I mean, where is that? What archives? Because of so many distilleries, both in Ireland and Scotland, weren't all that keen on keeping, detailed, documents and, their histories and production stuff. A lot of that was tossed out once a distillery went kaput. So where do you find that stuff?
So, not thankfully, but conveniently, a lot of these places in Ireland closed down. So the archives belonged to the state or were eaten up by the state. And Ireland has a very robust history of archivism, of people interested in, folk history and any industrial history, especially the public records of Northern Ireland actually have a shit ton of stuff. And that was really where I did a lot of the digging early on. The national archives in Ireland have stuff. So, for instance, when the Locks distillery closed, when the original Quebec distillery closed, the stuff was given to the state. So some of that stuff is available, and then some of it's important.
I actually worked with some of the stuff from the Public Records Office 35 years ago when I was working on my master's thesis. That was part of my work study with a professor. He was researching police records from the 1840s. And it was all there. The amount of stuff was amazing.
Yeah,
I can save you a lot of time and trouble with the Connick Distillery up in Mayo. That was built in the old Duffy's crusty nut bread factory. That's where my family's from. They even have a sign up in the tasting room saying Duffy's Corner. And
the nut part explains a lot.
Yeah. Well, actually,
The guy
You
who
know-
owns it actually is from my old neighborhood here in Chicago, Tom Jensen.
so bizarrely enough, I have found stuff from. So there weren't any, by the high industry era, there weren't any distilleries in Mayo. There was only really one in Connacht by the time we get to the Victorians, and that was in Galway City and connected by the rail line. But I did find recipes for poaching from the Sligo-Mayo border. And, of course, these mashes are very straightforward, but they tended to be either pure malted oats. And I think that's a big difference is, like there was malt and raw barley. The malt tax pretty much put the thumb down, not only on malt, but malted oats in a severe way. It's actually legalized. And so you still found malted oats used in poaching and raw oats used in legitimate Irish whiskey. And so a lot of the poaching from that area seems to have been basically either straight malted oats, dried over turf, or a mixture of malted barley and malted oats dried over turf. So a weird, single malt of a kind, but not of the kind that we know. So, strange stuff.
So dried over turf. Now, this has been a question that a lot of folks have asked over the years is if the Irish were using turf as their main source, especially to malt barley, to dry barley, dry any of the grain, when did they get away from that? When did they start using more enclosed kilns? Was it ever a thing to have that smoky character like the Connemara?
Yeah, so funnily enough, if you look in, and I was asked this question by Noel Sweeney very, very recently, Cooley, speaking of Connemara, and there's a specific parliamentary debate I found from the 1850s where they're talking about consumership of poaching versus whiskey, and it pretty much outlines more or less by 1850 all malt whiskey in Ireland, what we would call single malt whiskey, was made in Ulster. It was really historically a deep Ulster phenomenon outside the poaching scene, but even in that sense, Donegal was kind of poaching ground zero, and the Inishowen Peninsula in particular seems to have been basically the Irish Isla. And had history worked out differently, we probably would have seen small cottage industry semi-industrialized into something like you see in the Highlands. Unfortunately, in Scotland, you had things like the Small Stills Act, where they basically gave you a slack on tax, or the Highland Line, or these things where they were cutting slack to small distillers to kind of grow them or encourage illicit distillers to go legit. Whereas in Ireland, that didn't happen. And so what ended up happening was you got industrial distilling or urban distilling. And of course, urban distilling, by nature of the beast, moved toward closed iron kilns, and also just using less malt because we're making pot still. So, but in the 1850s, there is this debate, and they're saying the malt whiskey preferred in Ulster is smoky, is peated, and this will lure people off of poaching, because the reason the poaching drinkers don't like the Parliament, the Dublin pot still whiskey, is because it doesn't have the same taste. And the reason why, even Aeneas Coffey himself complained when he was a gouger, when he was a tax collector, that he couldn't sell the best poaching he confiscated in Dublin for less than the price of, legitimate whiskey, because they did taste very, very different. But in that debate, it pretty much outlines that, and this is elsewhere, that malt whiskey was pretty much made in Ulster, and B, more interestingly, that it was pretty much universally peated, which makes enormous fundamental sense. When that cuts out is open for debate, but as late as the 60s, Austin Boyd, the head of Bushmills, was saying that he sought a lightly peated character. So it takes a while.
I know Bushmills did a experimental batch back in the early 90s, which I believe was later released as Teelings. Teelings as a 21 and maybe a 24-year-old.
So back when Frank McCarty was working there, they did a number of double distilled Bushmills, playing around with crystal malt, all kinds of odd stuff. And the story is that it did not fit the brand portfolio, and a lot of it leaked out and was sold. So, I think John Teeling acquired quite a bit of it, but also European retailers. So you see all this stuff popping up in Europe in places like, the Whiskey Cask Company, the Nectar of the Daily Drams, Acla de France, all these retailers
Delicious.
in Germany.
It was really good.
Yeah, and so that's kind of lost generation Bushmills, and everybody, nobody's allowed to say what it is, but everybody knows, and you find it coming up in inexpensive whiskeys here. Certain whiskeys that are going for outrageous amounts of money are sharing the same fundamental liquid with whiskeys that are a fraction of the price, and everything in between. It's quite arbitrary in some sense. What gets branded or sold as what. But there is a certain cult around these McCarty era experimental Bushmills, and it's never been clear whether or not Bushmills still have some of it and just haven't put it out or what. So it's this stuff of legend. But some of the, especially the European retailers, seem to be quite cheeky about it, where they'll just say like County Antrim. They'll say it in any way possible without saying Bushmills, and some of them just come out and say Bushmills.
I had when I was over there, I was telling them, you got to release this. This could have been like how Buffalo Trace would do their experimental batches and release them, and I thought, God, guys, you have these doing the no, it's too much trouble.
They just had us over last fall, me and a couple other writers. And we were tasting a 28-year-old that had been finished out in cognac casks, I think, for the last 8 years. And it was a spectacular whiskey. But that sounds like that same general.
Their tropical rum cask is one of my favorites, and it's something that they've never really. They put it out as stores would buy a barrel, and they bought. Like Binny's or the old Sam's, and kills me. I thought,
I wanted to try and pull things together and into the current time. A kind of, I don't know, maybe a little bit of a saucy question, but and I know it's a really old word. I apologize for that.
Saucy.
Somewhat impertinent, shall we say? We've talked about the different types of Irish whiskey, and we talked about the overlap with Scotch. I mean, some of that overlap is obvious. What separates Irish whiskey? I mean, there's the single pot still, but that's just one part of it. What?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we've been sharing history. We used to be part of the same state. There's a lot of, and when people start talking about the thing that separates them, you start hearing all the triple distilled for smoothness bullshit. And in truth, it is a messier kind of set of dots on a graph, and there's a number of red and blue dots here, and then there say green and blue dots intersecting, and then there's some out there and some down there. And certainly the furthest, when people want to point to the distinctness of Irish whiskey, you find people talking about single pot still. But in truth, there's nothing legally to prevent someone on Islay from making single pot still if they chose. A lot of this stuff is heritage practice. And similarly, there's a number of people making, whiskey in Ireland that tastes, that doesn't just taste like Scotch, was actively modeled off Scotch. And so again, when we start talking about the concept, you get stuff being done in Ireland that has no history whatsoever, and that's brilliant and strange and to be encouraged. And you see stuff that hasn't been done in 150 years and is beautiful and strange and to be encouraged. And then there's the cross in between. If I was to talk from a historical perspective, and again, there's plenty of overlap, but what does prevail in the history of Irish distilling ultimately is this mash bill concept at the pot still level. And as that turns into something, again, they both overlapped quite extensively. But by the time whiskey isn't really whiskey in, Britain and Ireland until the 1850s. It's not, if we're talking about the definitions we use, an uncompounded grain spirit aged in a barrel for any length for 3 years, certainly, so by the time we get what we would call whiskey, they've diverged. And again, you have this mash bill culture in Ireland, more reminiscent of what was happening in the United States, where you have overlaps between practices of again, Dublin distillers tended to use higher malt contents and higher oat contents. And so you start seeing these like discriminatory practices between producers. And when that happens, Irish whiskey looks very, very different. And to the point where, as we enter the 20th century, when the What is Whiskey trial happens, when all the stuff that became Scotch whiskey legislation is drawn up, when that happens, Ireland is still part of the UK, and the Irish distillers talk about their procedure as distinctly Irish. I mean, you had people making stuff in Scotland that was imitative Irish whiskey, and that would be shorthandly referred to as Irish style whiskey. So by the time you get that separation, you're really talking about a malt tradition which overlapped with Ulster, and in the illegal sense, heavily with West Ulster and Donegal and North Connaught. And between, say, like, you could draw a line, say, from like Galway to Antrim, and northwest of that line is dense Poaching territory. And then you had legal cottage malt industry kind of copying that, especially in and around the north coast of Ulster. And then you have Dublin and Cork as single pot still capitals, and Midlands bound by the canals, and then the kind of eastern seaboard. So there were a lot of different things happening within Ireland. And then Belfast, where the colonial industry really did take off they made liquor like they built ships, just the latest technology in mass, industrial force, and they were very proud of doing exactly that. So, again, a lot of different shades of Irishness or Irish whiskiness throughout history. If we're to talk nostalgically about Irish distilling, then the like raw barley signature is definitely what a lot of people would point to very quickly as Ireland's contribution long term. And then if you talk about oats, and oats are more recent than a lot of people. A lot of people have had oated Irish whiskey and just don't know that they've had it. But you find like any Powers, Redbreast, etc. from the 60s, they've all got old. They all had about 15 to 20% oats in them, and it was only quite late that disappeared or shrunk down and then was blended out. So again, there's that factor as well. And I think oats, you talk to like Peter down in Blackwater and lads up in Ecklandville and Cullowen and some of the kind of noisier craft distilleries today, and they'd certainly be interested in that side of it. And oats in particular, oats in tandem with raw barley, and of course wheat and rye as well.
See, so now that's a good segue, because I'm interested in the current state of distilling. I saw a map recently, just in the last week or so, someone posted on LinkedIn, showing about 30 active distilleries.
Uh-huh.
Now, most of these, I'm assuming, are, when they say active, they've just started.
Yeah.
Because not too long ago, I was looking into most of them, and most of them weren't built yet. So they must have just got the thing going. However, there's been a big brouhaha over there over the last couple of years that kind of mirrors what happened over here in the States, with a lot of craft distilleries coming up with kind of phony backgrounds or claiming heritage from brands that once existed, and all sorts of stuff. And there was a lot of backlash among whiskey drinkers, Irish whiskey drinkers. There's a renewed interest over there, and they didn't like all this, especially since a lot of the juice out there was being sourced. So what's the current state of affairs as far as a lot of these distilleries?
Yeah, I mean, and again, like there were, and I remember when this was breaking at the time, and the first thoughts that cracked into my head were, things like the reaction to MGP rye when that first broke in America, or, people feeling betrayed that, this stuff was forced. And then it kind of comes to the point where, people start being more transparent and saying, well, yes, we did get it, and that's not really the problem you think it is, but we're going to be honest about it, and blah, blah, blah. And I think Ireland is hitting that point where people are starting to be clearer about it. But yeah, there was a lot of, paddywhackery of like brands that were 2 months old that were claiming to be from the 1700s, and so kind of cringeworthy shit, and not dissimilar to again, like a lot of the complaints that were made about certain brand narratives in the United States. And where it starts to get a bit more serious is where people start claiming to be, say, a distillery, and there is no distillery, and you see these labels that can be extremely misleading, and they'll back down, they say like this distillery company or something, and you think, what the hell is a distillery company if not a company with a distillery? And they'll say, well, we didn't call ourselves a distillery, and this kind of just.
Yeah, you're a whiskey company, not a distilling company.
Carry on, yeah.
You're putting out whiskey, but you're not distilling.
Now, at the same time, I think what happened almost there was a lot of stock coming on early where you had, say the Cooley distillery, who almost by accident became the kind of MGP where they were supplying a lot of the stock. And they got a backlash from people saying, oh, this is a Cooley clone. It's all coming out of Cooley. And actually, Cooley malt is lovely. But again, I think there was a lot of hostility about how, and there's still plenty out there. And I think now, say out of 33, there's really about, say, circa 15 distilleries who have, 3-year-old whiskey even. And there's a number of them who are starting to supply into the bloodstream as well. So there's, say, like West Cork distillers. John Teeling's Great Northern Distillery has basically become
it's the MGP
of what Cooley did by accident, Great Northern will do on purpose. And and it's impressive. And to be fair to John and to all of them up there, they're not just making stuff to sell, they're making different styles. They're saying, okay, here's our double distilled peated, triple distilled peated, double distilled pot distilled, triple. I don't know if they're doing double distilled pot still, but double distilled malt, triple distilled malt, and shop as you like and blend as you wish, which has facilitated a number of really cool entrants. So you have people like, Killowen or Two Stacks, which is, really half the same guys on their own venture, being quite clear about, well, since we got it from all from one place, we can be explicit about saying, well, this is 13% double distilled peated malt mixed with 5% triple, etc., and have these complex breakdowns. So actually, what used to be the kind of monster or skeleton in the closet of the revival, certain luminaries, Louise down in Clare with JJ Corey has been a visionary in this, in turning whiskey bonding into an act of transparency, building that, making it less of an accusation and more of a point of pride. So there's that side of it as well that's coming on tap. And as that's happening, there's a lot of stuff that was done that, at the distillery level. So like Teeling have their first genuinely peated Teeling malt, which is a triple distilled peated malt. Coming out soon, the Black Pits malt. It's starting. I think the Irish whiskey renaissance is really going to happen this time 3 years from now, when all of this starts to come out. When there starts to be 10-year-old Ecklenville spirit, when there starts to be even like a Dingle 10, that kind of when and not even just them as 10-year-olds, but all the other guys as much younger own releases. So there's almost two industries happening. There's one, as people come up with a more creative and adult relationship with sourcing and how to handle that, which again, echoes in many ways, the what happened in the US. And then the other is cool stock being laid down at the ground. And I think that stuff, when you talk to the people who are really making waves there, they're getting a lot of notoriety now, but the spirit is still, looks like this.
Would you say there's a lot of overlap with those categories? So I guess just comparing it back to the craft whiskey industry in the States, where we have companies, right? We're laying down stocks, we're doing innovative things, but while those are maturing, we're also making we're creating these special blends to have offerings to the consumer. Is that sort of a parallel situation, or?
Some of them, yeah, absolutely. And even ones like, again, so say you get one extreme, so like Dingle, with the exception of a very, very, very fleeting trial blend done before they built the distillery to see if they could make money off it. In any real sense, Dingle has always been just Dingle, and they put it out when it was very, very young, and and that was it. And then it's aged since, but it has always been clear that it was just that. Versus, say, on the other hand, like Killowen Distillery, who are one of the coolest, most talked about guys on the island at the moment, and that notoriety has been driven by the spirit they're laying down, just them like burning turf into oats on site and whatnot. But on the back almost of that notoriety that was earned through the strangeness of the distilling, people are taking their source products very, very seriously.
Yeah.
You know, they almost kind of fed each other. And so Killowen have been hyper transparent about, in fact, actually, there was a bit of, you guys may have seen this. I don't know if you saw this, Marty. Brendan up there had to take a Sharpie to his labels because he was
Yeah, I heard about that.
Too transparent, essentially. He was breaking down the age statement.
Redacted.
And then he, you know, brilliantly put it on Facebook saying, from now on, I'll be vandalizing our labels, and made almost a press of it. But again, you know, that kind of level has been, you know, instrumental in allowing small distillers the oxygen to breathe, you know, while they, again, like the US.
Yeah.
While they wait for this stuff to age.
Hey, Finn, we're coming down to the end of our time. First, real quick, Monique did mention, yeah, that's right, the Gelston. That's a really delicious. I like that. I don't know if it's just the 125-year-old.
So there's the 26, which is almost certainly Frank McCarty Bushmills, especially if he consulted.
That was really good.
Which, by the way, actually, Frank McCarty will be on our show on the 29th of September. So shameless plug.
Mark that calendar.
In, write it down.
Shameless with a lot of shame.
With a
also, Dara Daly mentions that Kilbeggan pot still and Drumshanbo pot still both contain oats in
Correct.
the bill. So that is happening.
Yeah, so that's just so like Kilbeggan, you know, and Kilbeggan is a branch of Cooley, really, and a lot of experimental runs were done in the small stills in the Kilbeggan site about 8 years back. So that, I mean, those things were light years ahead of where the industry is now. So they did a number of pot still mashes, one of which was essentially bullied into being called Kilbeggan Rye, even though it's a mix of malt and raw barley and a rye adjunct that does not fit the current.
Is that after Beam bought them?
Yes, well, they did the experiment beforehand, and then the stuff only came out recently.
I love that stuff.
Oh yeah, and of course it's not a rye.
I'm on my third bottle.
Yeah,
really.
Today. That's his third bottle.
Yeah, that's today, but Yeah.
And a very interesting whiskey, almost by accident became the testing ground for, the mistakes of the GI. When you had a whiskey that was only about 30% rye, being compelled to call itself rye, something that never would have flown in the US. Now I know, you get away in Canada, but not rye whiskey in the sense of American rye, but never intended really to be rye. I mean, I remember when it was laid down and everyone was very excited about rye tinted Irish pot still, a mixture of raw barley and malt as the main backdrop, and then a heavy rye adjunct. And I mean, if I was to, if I found myself in some sort of godlike position tomorrow and was able to rewrite the GI in my own image,
which you may
to Adam, with my thesis trailing behind me on the Sistine Chapel, I would say, at least 30% malt, at least 30% raw barley, as it currently says, and up to 30% wheat, oats, or rye. If you want to be really strict, you could police the adjunct internally in progression, but I think up to 30 allows for a very flexible, category while still maintaining a 70% majority. And it's quite attuned to the history there. Really, the only one that hit 30% would be oats. Rye again was historically much smaller. So that Kilbeggan ended up being an accident because you're taking the most aggressive grain, the least historically prevalent, and putting it in that context, the highest permissible portion. And it still doesn't taste like rye. That's as far as it gets from green spot. It's still very recognizably Irish pot still. So even as a case study of what that category might look like, it accidentally, through no intention, set a stake at the other end of the field. So again, I think, it will change. I mean, we could have a whole talk just about Go on, Liz. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned earlier in the show that there was rye being imported from North America. Has that changed? Is that more of a Central European import now?
Well, nobody's distilling it, so or in any sort of quantity. So we'll see how it comes.
Okay.
Rye has been grown in Ireland for centuries. The Irish for rye is Chagall, and you still find places with Chagall in the name.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
there wasn't the same rye bread tradition or even really rye distilling in the sense that you see in like Central Europe and outside the Netherlands.
Rye was a big German grain.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it thrives in cold, dry places. Ireland is only one of those things. And a near miss. But of course, a lot of it's coming in. I mean, as is peated malt. Despite the fact that we're living on a floating bog.
Never mind that.
One kind of cool group who are now doing peated malt in a very small quantity and basically just drying turf over open air stuff, nothing close to Port Ellen scale. But most of these peated Irish malts are bringing in the peated malt from the likes of Port Ellen maltings. So we'll see how that supply chain changes, as things progress. There's so little rye distilled in Ireland that it would probably be functionally rather easy to source Irish rye. And of course, encouragements to grow it. Again, a lot of people grew rye as a winter crop, essentially a restorative crop.
Cover crop.
Yeah, cover crop, exactly.
To take us out, I was hoping you'd recap. You took me on a nice little walking tour of the Liberties in Dublin and showed me where the remnants. It was amazing. It's like going to Pompeii and seeing, here's a brick wall that used to be part of this brewery, and it's all behind the Guinness brewery. Here's an old distillery. Here's this. There's this. But you also talked about the great Dublin distillery fire. Can you talk about that? We missed the anniversary. It was last month.
Yeah, that's right. The Liberties area, which was the area just outside the city proper, became a huge brewing and distilling hub, really the distilling hub in Dublin, and arguably in terms of clout in Ireland. And basically in the 1700s, an edict declared, in under George IV, that you had to funnel in grain through an area called Cornmarket to basically, ease the taxman's job. And grain comes into the city along the Liberties, along Thomas Street. And you had a number of brewers and distillers taking advantage of that and buying stuff off them cheap and whatnot. And that within a few generations becomes, what used to be a mire of petty distillers becomes Powers, becomes the big players, Marrowbone Lane, Powers. Of the four big Dublin distilleries, Jameson, Marrowbone Lane, Powers, and Rowe, three of them, all of them except Jameson, were in the Liberties. And again, a huge, funnily enough, like probably the most well-known, nostalgic ballad of Dublin is Dublin in the Rare Old Times, where the guy singing, the narrator, is a cooper who's lost his job because there's no work. Right. And, intimately tied, actually, oddly enough, to the demise of the distilling industry. So when you actually look at the background to that, like my trade that fell to progress, my home's a memory, or like my, anyway.
I hear that song now, and I think if the guy had just held on another 20 years,
oh yeah,
he'd probably be okay.
And again, he says quite clearly he's from the Liberties, etc. And and Guinness is still there, obviously. But they were there for exactly the same reasons. Where were we getting with all this? Sorry. The fire.
The fire.
The fire.
So aside from the distilleries themselves, which were huge, and they had by their heyday, they had on-site cooperages, etc. So one of the things that happened in Ireland that didn't happen in Scotland, one of the clearest trajectories, was a guy named Beresford, he's the guy behind the customs department in Ireland, and he very cannily, he was not a great guy, kind of a shit really, but in retrospect, he was a good friend long term to the course of Irish distilling, because he basically said, look, Why are we chasing all these poaching distillers down the rushy glen? It's an absolute waste of the government's time. They have no tax money to pay, even if we do catch them. And he's right from a sheer pragmatic, point of view. This is a huge waste of time and resources. Why don't we reward scale and tax the big guys who we can monitor because it's difficult to cover anything? And he said, concentrate it in the hands of gentlemen of capital. And he gave rewards to them if they got bigger. But the other thing he did was he ensured that they had to comply to regulations at the same time, specifically the geometry of stills. They couldn't, in Scotland, you have the whole thing with urban distillers having the low to the ground rapid distillations, and all the lowland stuff, the Steens and the Haigs ends up tasting like muck. And, that was happening in Dublin too, but it's essentially regulated out. So you have developing in Dublin these huge distilleries, but they're these big bulbous pots. Quite iconic. They have big bulbs and then offset necks, and the ancestors to the Middleton pots, but even there, it's not quite the same. And so they have these enormous, for a pot distillery, enormous capabilities, and then they have stock all over the place across the Liberties, bonded warehousing. And so anyway, Malone's bonded warehouse catches fire, and of course it spreads like magma through the area. Just high strength alcohol flowing through the street, mixing with whatever effluence, and of course the fire you had horrible tenement housing in Dublin, and especially that part of Dublin at that time, and people were burned out of their homes, huge loss of property and life. 13 people died,
but
according to the newspapers, everyone died of alcohol poisoning.
What year was this? I'm sorry.
So this is the 1870s, 1878, I believe. Now, It should be said that the British press of the time did not have exactly a charitable reading of the Irish. It wouldn't be the first time poor people in Ireland were misrepresented as alcoholics, but it does make for a very good story. And the odd part, the part that is demonstrably true, was the handling of the fire. So you had a guy named James Robert Ingram, who was the head of the Dublin Fire Brigade. And he had returned to Ireland from New York, where he had worked with the New York Fire Brigade, and basically paved the foundation stones of the modern Irish fire department, bringing all of that know-how back. And Ireland at the time was, still a city of horse and cart, and basically all the taxis brought the collected horse shite of the day from, the people really driving the taxis to a depot at the end of the day. And he had all of the cabbies bring the cumulative horse dung to the Liberties, and they basically built barricades to stop the flaming liquid, because they couldn't water it to make things worse. So anyway, they basically stifled it out with shite.
That stopped people from drinking the whiskey. Did that flavor the whiskey, or that kind of
complex cones?
Oh my God!
Whatever about Irish whiskey and turf, there's a lot of options out there that have yet to be explored, that can be possibly drawn from history. We'll see.
Smoking horse dung's one of them.
Yeah, exactly. Good taste of agriculture.
That's for the next thesis paper.
Real quickly, we were asked what we were drinking. I have what is this? Firestone. Yeah, Firestone and Robertson. They're TX brand. This is an experimental rye whiskey they sent me.
Cool.
It's good.
Trying to keep with the whole theme of today. I stuck with a single pot still, and so a little green spot, a little Redbreast 12, deliciosus, gorgeous. Liz?
Speaking of rye, I'm drinking Canada Dry.
Whoa! That's what I always heard about you.
You have to work or something?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. We got a split, but before we do, don't forget, this guy over here wrote this over here, glass apart.
That's all old news. That's his book.
It's good, though. It's good reading, especially night reading. If you really want to go to sleep fast, this is the book.
Oh, I've started like an ASMR channel, which is just me, reading it. The GI,
I want the audiobook.
Yeah.
If anyone's curious, the white stuff I was drinking, I was drinking first Killowan's smoked Irish pot still non-GI
Oh.
new make, and then Peter O'Ryan's 1950s, which actually came from a collaboration. I handed him some documents and he distilled them. So I've
cool.
quite a visceral relationship with this particular.
Right.
We will
Maybe.
have Peter on next month, September 8th. He will be joining us.
We're going to get into it with him about the technical file.
Oh,
Yeah, baby.
Yeah, because you know he's eager to.
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, we had some listeners today that wanted to get it on with you about that, and we decided to put it off until Peter, because all that shit you were saying was pretty interesting, so we just let you run.
But, you know, here, young Finn, thank you very much for joining us. We'll lift a glass to you, a parting glass, if you will. How about that? We part a
Sinister
parting glass.
implication.
Let's see what. Here's to. There are long ships. There are tall ships. There are ships that sail the seas. But the best ships are friendships, and may they always be. Aye.
Provided they quarantine for 14 days upon arrival.
But in all seriousness, if you haven't gotten Fionnán's book yet, you can get it down below. So grab the link.
Link up. Do it.
Link up.
So
And
thanks
we'll
for
be back.
joining.
We'll
Yeah,
be back
thank you,
next
guys.
month. We'll be back next week with the Blum brothers, both of them, in one screen, I think. So that's our first time ever. So join us next week, same bat channel, same bat time. Finn, be careful over there. That island's very small. I'm just waiting for it to just tip over someday.
I know.
All right, try to push it closer to the continent. You know, that way it gives you a little ballast. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Everyone be good.
Good
Take
to see
care.
everybody.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.